All right, looks like we're live. Okay, welcome everyone. And thank you very much for taking the time today to join this session. We started kind of this series of little expert panels, expert sessions to kind of pick the brains of folks in the industry that have a bunch of experience and background in some really cool areas. We've got a really awesome topic today that I'm very excited about and have been thinking about for a while now. We're going to talk a lot about how brands can think about building their global payment stack, some of the pain points that they might expect to run into, and sort of different ways they should think about their payment strategy, depending on where they're at in different parts of the life cycle of their business. And it's going to be a really cool discussion, just going a little bit deeper on some of the areas that brands need to be thinking about now to have success in the future. And we've got a really cool guest with us today. Somebody I've been looking forward to talking to for quite some time, and I think he's going to be able to share a lot of really insightful information. Before we dive in, I'll just do a quick introduction of myself, and then I'll let Matt do the same as well. I'm Dan Brewer, and I'm going to try to kind of moderate and lead most of the discussion today. And I lead the sales and marketing organization at ExpandNow. And if you're not familiar with ExpandNow, we are a merchant of record provider that basically helps brands scale their e-commerce businesses internationally and make it really easy for them to enter new markets without a lot of the pain that they would otherwise face in areas like payments and tax. And with me today, as I mentioned before, somebody I've been really excited to talk to and a company that I love to engage with in general. I've got Matthew Finnelli, who's leading the global strategy for Adyen's Adyen for Platforms product, which if you're not familiar is a really cool product, does some incredibly powerful things, really geared towards platforms and marketplaces that want to embed payments in their offering. Matthew, thanks for joining. I really appreciate you investing some time today, and I'll let you say a few words just to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. Like you said, my name is Matt Finnelli, and I'm with Adyen. For those not familiar with Adyen, we are a global payments platform for accepting payments. We help businesses grow both in their home and international markets and seamlessly connect online and in-store commerce. Generally work with a lot of well-known global B2C brands, as well as partners like ExpandNow to enable efficient payment experiences. And in my role specifically, I take care of our retail platforms and marketplaces strategy.
All right, very cool, very cool. Yeah, I've personally worked with the Adyen for Platforms product quite a bit, and I can tell you it's a very powerful offering. The capabilities are kind of mind-blowing in some areas. I know we as a company have been able to do quite a bit with it, so I'm excited to have you.
Excited to be part of this.
Good. All right, so we'll dive in. I'll give you a little bit of context on our discussion first, and then we'll kind of go through each of the topics. We've got 30 to 45 minutes, and so we'll just kind of see where the conversation goes. And we'll try to take some questions at the end as well, which you can submit through the StreamYard app. So we've really geared this discussion towards e-commerce businesses, DTC brands. And so if you're someone inside of one of those businesses who's really focused on optimizing your payment strategy and all the things that sit around payments, hopefully this will be a really relevant discussion for you. And we've structured the discussion to talk about a few different areas. We're going to spend the first roughly 15 minutes with Matt and I just kind of talking about the different pain points that we see quite a bit in the industry from brands who are either building a payment stack for the first time or they're really trying to scale their business to the next level. And then we'll spend about the same amount of time, about 15 minutes, talking about some very specific brand profiles. Think of these as like different phases of your journey as a company, and what you need to be thinking about in those phases to be successful in the future. And then we'll each of us take 5 or 10 minutes and just talk about one really practical thing that we think brands can focus on for the next 1 to 2 quarters, just to really position themselves for success in the future. Whether their plans are to expand into lots of markets or 1 or 2, we'll try to give you some advice based on what we've seen in the market in the past. All right, cool. So we will just dive in here, and Matt, I'll kind of kick us off. We had talked about some of the biggest pain points that we see in the market from brands today, and just our collective experience from talking to brands for many years. And you and I kind of came up with a few that I think pop up a lot. And I'll just kind of tee up the first one, and then I'd love to get your feedback. I've been in the digital commerce space, I guess now for about 15 years. It feels like a lot longer, but about 15 years. And I can tell you the most common thing I see from brands when I'm having discussions about where they're taking their business or the next initiative they have on their plate is actually not really like payments on its own. Oftentimes it's all the adjacent requirements to payments. It's the things that sit right around payments that are equally as hard to deal with, and in many cases harder. And the ones that I see a lot are brands' ability to deal with tax regulations, managing VAT, GST, sales tax. That's a crazy space right now because it's gotten so much more complicated in the last 5 to 10 years, right? Managing fraud, fraud in the e-commerce space it's a really big problem for brands today to sell physical goods, especially in markets that they don't have a lot of familiarity with.
Yep.
And then just all kinds of other like back office requirements, like invoicing obligations that exist in a bunch of markets today. I just talked to a brand the other day who was a bit worried about being compliant with export controls in the US, right? And all these things are not payments per se, but they sit right around payments, and they become barriers, hurdles to overcome. And they really have to work seamlessly with your payment strategy. And so I see that a lot. I'd love to get your feedback on, is that a pain point that Adyen sees quite a bit? And what have your experiences been in that area?
Yeah, definitely agree. I think sales tax or tax in general is something we see come up quite a bit, especially when you're looking at cross-border expansion. Somebody may be used to the US state-based tax systems with individual states, and then of course some local municipal taxes. And then you expand over to Europe or some other markets, and you're now dealing with a VAT, the VAT, which is an entirely different construct in terms of how it works. So even if you as a brand have fully grasped and have that solution in place, you're basically starting over from zero in many ways when you go into these new markets. And it works the inverse that way as well. If you're used to a VAT tax system, the fact that you go across the pond and you're adding sales tax, and now the actual transaction price changes. They're not, that's something that brands aren't used to working with that either. So being able to put some predictability and clarity in terms of what to expect is a big need for some of those brands. I think another thing is you might get really good at dealing with fraud in disputes, even in your home market. But as you expand into new ones, the fraud actors might look a little bit different. And are you able to quickly adjust for that? Because if you're expanding into a new market and quickly run into some fraud issues, that's a great way to have a really suboptimal start to your journey into a new market, where you might have to take some pretty drastic actions to plug that. So again, it goes back to kind of a degree of stability and predictability that can let being able to let a brand not worry too much and keep them up at night thinking about those things, when what you really want to do is make sure you're successful driving new revenue in these markets that you go into.
Yeah, I think that's right on. Yeah, everyone who listens to our webinars knows that I love to talk about tax, which would seem like a really boring topic for a bunch of people, but I love to talk about tax. One, because I'm so fascinated by just some of the changes that have happened in the industry for the last handful of years. I always feel like I'm seeing this trend in parts of the world that want to tax foreign companies, non-residents, right? And I think I maybe see a lot of that because I came a lot from the digital commerce space. Companies who sell software, SaaS products. And if you're in that part of the market, you already know that the whole world has changed. There's now 100+ countries that have tax regulations that apply to foreign sellers. So it used to be pretty easy to sell your software all over the world, and now it's gotten a lot more complex. And I think you really highlighted the point there. Brands are usually very familiar with their home country's tax system. Once you start talking about 100+ different tax systems around the world, it's just the complexity just explodes, and it becomes this very overwhelming hurdle to overcome. Yeah, very cool. The last thing I would say on this pain point too, Matt, and I don't know if you see this much yourself, but we're kind of in like the age of the ecosystem of apps. And I talk to brands all the time who they're trying to solve these problems with lots of apps, lots of different third-party products. And one of the more common pieces of feedback I hear is there's a lot of great products out there to solve for fraud and solve for tax and solve for these cross-border use cases, but it's not always the case that they play nice together, meaning they don't always work perfectly when you pair them all up, right?
Yep.
I hear that many times. I'm just curious if that's feedback that you see in the market as well.
It's definitely something you can see happen. And I think one of the key things is even being able to find the right apps when you go into a new market. It is indeed by definition new. Do you have the right solutions? Are they going to integrate with all of the systems, CRM, all of those kind of things? Even going outside of payments and looking at things like how you engage with customers. You go to Europe, you have to start thinking about GDPR compliance with your email outreach. There's plenty to think about there, but definitely could be some pain points there where if you start to put too much of a wobbly stack together, something's bound to break it at some point in time.
Something's bound to break. Yep, I agree. Yeah, I always joke to some of my colleagues that there's actually something very positive to be said about the old days of some of the more monolithic commerce solutions. Companies that did lots of things all in one. There were some nice parts of that, actually. Very good. All right. Matt, I wanted to talk about maybe another pain point that we at ExpandNow see emerging quite a bit. And it really revolves around brands like developing a unified approach to all of their sales channels. This is something that's changed over the years, right? Because the olden days used to look a lot like just a lot of retail commerce. And, now you have direct to consumer e-commerce. You have retail commerce that kind of looks like social commerce sometimes. You have in-person commerce. And I think a lot of brands really wrestle with how they unify that strategy. because the reality is you may not be controlling the payment side of all those sales channels, but there's a point in your back office where all of these sales channels do come together, right? And you as a business need to think about how you're going to deal with reconciling cash and, how you receive payments from these third parties inside of your own business. Thoughts in this area, Matt, and what challenges brands might face?
Yeah, I mean, you can get very tactically speaking with reconciling to your actual cash flow, but even going a step higher than that, having ready-made, accessible insights, how your business is performing. You certainly want to see the breakdown of is my marketplace channel overperforming, underperforming. Expectations are things trending in one way or another, but also how do I see the view of my customers across these? Might be a direct-to-consumer brand where you initiate the customer relationship online. Maybe they found you on social media. They start purchasing, and then there's pop-up retail, or you start to have stores. You want to be able to recognize that customer, whether it's using the data for things like customer engagement and loyalty, or just being able to have those insights on your business. How much of the business is kind of a repeat customer versus still bringing in net new, and expanding that addressable market. So I think that's a really important piece of it. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you still want to be able to look and see how the business is performing, those true financial metrics. And if you spend all your time day to day doing a manual reconciliation of that, you're going to spend more time doing that actual effort to get to the end number than you're going to have able to actually look at those insights and see, what do I need to do? Is there a strategic shift that I need to make? Are there different geographical considerations to start to look at? And using those same data points can also, if you have that richness of data, that's going to help you with your expansion strategy, whether that's in your home market or starting to expand cross-border.
Yeah, I think you're right on the point you made in there about customers purchasing across existing sales channels. I think really resonates with me. And keep me honest here, Matt. At Adyen, you're helping a lot of brands sort of bring together online commerce and offline commerce to help unify those channels.
Yeah, that is a lot of what we are able to do in terms of recognizing customers, putting the tooling in place that whether it's a marketplace or a lot of these commerce platforms that are working in multiple channels, online, marketplace, in store, as good examples, but even thinking about new ones like it's not far beyond us now that we have to start looking at agentic, right? Right now, agentic commerce kind of looks like the early days of social. Nobody knew where it was going to go. There's a lot of different models out there. What is it going to mean for brands? We think very much around on that topic that we want to keep the merchants keeping their relationship with their customers and keeping that customer data, so that they continue to have that valuable source of information, and that is certainly with the DTC brands and all the ones that have a very strong B2C brand following, having that better experience that Adyen can help provide. That's just a more delightful shopping experience in any channel, and plays right into customer engagement and loyalty and being able to get more value out of those. Because a lot of brands we do see, repeat customers can drive a lot of incremental revenue.
Yeah, there's just so many paths to a payment now, with agentic commerce. Now you have all these social commerce channels that, end up looking a lot like direct to consumer commerce.
Yeah.
There's just so many paths to a payment that the back office of these brands has gotten so much more complicated in the last few years. It's a good opportunity though. These sales channels present different ways for brands to sell their products that didn't exist years ago, and offer ways to really convert customers in places that they exist and spend their time. All right, very cool. Well, look, this last pain point, I gotta say, it drives me nuts every time I hear it, Matt. I talk to a lot of brands who, from my perspective, are really biting off more than they can chew, right? There's a lot of different ways you can spin that, but there's been a lot of brands in the past 5 to 10 years that have really taken this approach of expanding their business everywhere in the world all at once, right? In my industry, this started to happen years ago with a lot of providers who came out with cross-border commerce solutions. It was really geared towards take your direct-to-consumer branded store and just open it up to the world, right? I can't count the number of times. It sounds amazing. It sounds amazing. Yeah. Sounds very easy. And at a surface level, it's a strategy that just about every brand would say yes to, right? Do you want to sell in 200 plus countries? Yes. The most common thing I hear though is I'm having a lot of success in a couple of markets, and then the rest, the 198 on top of that, not so much, right? And so I hear a lot of brands who are just kind of wrestling with this idea of, do I go big? Do I pick one or two, excel at it, and then figure out, the next round of countries? And I'm curious to get your feedback on that. If a brand comes to Adyen with this ambitious expansion strategy, which path are you coaching them down?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and doubly so for Adyen, because that's one of our core value propositions, right? Is we will help you expand internationally. We have the connections to the local payment methods that you need. That said, it's also in our interest to make sure that you're doing that in a streamlined and scalable way. I'm an ex-consultant, so very aware of that kind of cringeworthy phrase, boil the ocean, right? A lot of these brands might try to do that. And it just, you're taking on too much at once, and making a lot of assumptions going into that, where if you're able to do a little bit of experimenting, seeing what works and what doesn't, you might have a strong brand going into certain markets, but the product mix might look different. Yeah. Are you targeting the right segment of customers? Maybe that looks different from market to market. Now, that's one of the things that we think, hey, these are the areas that the brand owner should be spending most of their time on. In doing that, you want to make the back end side of that a little bit easier. How do you look into going into a select number of new markets, potentially test it, do a little bit of A/B testing, but you're not, if you go all in on that and you're gonna say, well, we spent all this effort and bandwidth to go into a new market, like it's got to work. Sometimes being able to test a few, we try five new ones, maybe 3 of them work, slide away from the other 2 and start experimenting in some other ones. That's going to get you into a more scalable place and set up for longer term success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is kind of a double-edged sword, I would say, for companies like Adyen and like ExpandNow. And I say that because we're building products to try and solve for the entire globe. We want to enable brands to sell where their customer base is, but that doesn't mean that that's always the best strategy for every brand. Some brands have universal appeal all over the world and don't have much local competition. Mm-hmm. Other brands have to be very market specific in their approach. And depending on where you sort of fit in that range, I think you've got to really think hard about tailoring your strategy. And that may mean narrowing down your expansion plans to a handful of markets to figure out the formula and then apply this sort of test and learn strategy that you talked about to the rest of the world and sort of go where the data tells you to go. So I think this is a tough one. I kind of go back and forth quite a bit, Matt, but I always find it helpful to.
There's no easy answer, right? I mean, we can advise, but the brands also know their business best. So
brands
we share the good stories and the bad stories, and hope we can help them land in the right spot.
Yep. And I think for companies like Adyen and ExpandNow, I think we oftentimes think of ourselves as enabling these strategies, whether you're ready for all of them today or not, depends on your business. But our job is really to enable them when you are ready. Very good. All right. Well, that's a lot of pain. I'm always a little bit, I feel a little stressed out after we talk about all the hard things around payments. Let's transition a little bit and talk about different brand profiles and what you should be caring about when you're inside of these profiles. I always find it really helpful to personalize the experience a little bit, because you can't talk about what should Microsoft care about in the same conversation with some startup who's got a whole different set of problems to solve for and a very different set of objectives. And so I always feel like sort of profiling people and putting them into categories is a little bit helpful when we talk about what they should be thinking about for their business. And I kind of picked out 3 profiles that I think are really relevant, that much of our audience would sort of be able to fit themselves into. And we'll talk about those profiles, and they basically are fast-growing D2C brands. If you're a $5 to $10 million brand, born direct, you're a fast-growing D2C brand. We've got another profile that I call the marketplace expander. I know, super creative, but these are sort of like D2C brands who are discovering a lot of new marketplaces, TikTok, Meta Commerce, right? Categories like that. And then one of my favorites, the ambitious startup, right? The ambitious startup. This is the company who has just gotten the wheels off the runway and they see a path to success. They've got huge growth ambitions, but they also got a lot going on. Right. Yep. And they're trying to figure out what they need to care about to be successful in the future. So let's talk about, let's first hit the fast growing D2C brand. Matt, if you're a $5 to $10 million brand, you got there fast and you got a path to 100 million. What should you be thinking about right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, depending on the market that you're starting in, you're growing fast. If I see that growth is continuing in my home market, I want to stay there and continue to double down, at least for the time being. But then you're starting to see something that's resonating in the market with your, in this case, likely consumers. I think you start to think about what a international expansion might look like. There's a lot of kind of commonality, right? If you're a US brand starting to look abroad, you're going to naturally look towards Canada, the UK, Australia, some markets like that. I think those are really interesting ways to do it. Certainly from the US expanding into Canada is probably a pretty low-hanging fruit, but also that's where you're going to start to learn where that's probably the easiest expansion route. And if you're running into some pain points there, it's just a little bit of a preview that everywhere you do try to expand, you have to be cognizant that not knowing what you don't know quite yet. But I think being able to experiment there, understand your customer, what has succeeded, what do we need to be prepared for in certain new markets. But overall, I think it really depends on where you're starting from, how you think you're able to continue building with what you have in your existing market, and then starting to think and strategize ahead in terms of what's going to come next.
Yeah, I think that's some incredibly practical advice, because you said something in there that I think a lot of brands might need to hear in some cases. Global expansion is not always the biggest opportunity you have right around the corner. If you're getting a lot of that fast pace of growth out of your domestic market, and there's a lot more to get, that may be the place that you should focus for the time being, until your next biggest opportunity is a new market, right? I actually feel like in the space I come from, in merchant of record, this is one of the profiles I love, because there's a really strong case to be made in my mind for this bifurcated strategy. You be the expert in your domestic market. You've gotten to 5 to 10 million. You have the capability to do it. You can really lean on a merchant of record capability to help you get to the rest of the world. And the reason I think there's such a strong case in that strategy, and you and I have talked about this before, that the level of investment it takes to use merchant of record to go explore the world is so much lower than it would be if you built out, your domestic capabilities in all these new markets.
Yeah.
I just feel like, as a finance person myself, there's such a strong ROI for that fast growing startup to having this bifurcated strategy and kind of separating yourself from the big, hairy, complicated investments that it takes to go international.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, there's the timeline of it as well, right? Can you accelerate that by several months? And then you really get a better, if you have momentum and you really do truly see that opportunity to expand internationally, you start in a way that's going to get you there faster, but without having burned quite so many resources in doing so. And then, sure, down the road, if things change, it's maturing, you're building a really solid foundation, then you might rethink the model that you're doing there. But you might not get there in the first place if you don't have the right timing and the right ability to, in some of those cases, take a few risks and just have a, streamlined strategy for where you want to go in terms of new markets.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Well, this next profile, Matt, is near and dear to my heart. I will tell you, I've learned a lot about marketplace expansion over the last year. My background has been primarily in direct-to-consumer e-commerce, but there's something so interesting that's been happening in the market recently, especially in the area of social commerce. And I spent a lot of time in the last couple of years exploring Meta, TikTok Shop, and there's something so interesting to me that I think it's the same reason why it's appealing for brands. It's almost like this extension of your existing direct-to-consumer e-commerce business, but in a much more powerful place, right? Think about TikTok Shop, for example. And for folks out there that are not familiar with TikTok Shop, you're basically just embedding commerce opportunities inside of your business's content, right? In the place that so many browsers, so many people are browsing for products, or not even necessarily products, just themes and brands and ideas and stuff like that. And I think that's probably the reason why there's just so much interest in this area right now. We see brands all day long knocking on our door, trying to solve for the complexities of getting their business on TikTok Shop. And it has some incredibly interesting overlaps with the complexities they face in their own direct-to-consumer store as well. Because they're a marketplace, it usually involves having local companies, local tax registrations, and oftentimes people who actually live in the market that you'd like to do business in. So I can understand why brands are really interested in it, and I can see this big challenge that they're going to face because getting onto these marketplaces isn't always easy. Tell us about your experiences here, Matt. What should somebody who wants to get onto TikTok or Meta or fill in the blank marketplace be thinking about so they can be successful in the future?
Yeah, I think one of the top thing that comes to my mind on this front is just looking at the market by market requirements. When you think about these big marketplaces, they are truly the most global brands out there. Your Metas, TikToks of the world, and you might think, okay, well, I'm a continental European brand, and I'm going to use this to start experimenting and see if I can build a following in the UK. That's going to be fine when you're just sharing content. When you start trying to turn that content into selling goods or services and collecting money from UK-based payments, UK consumers, that's where you start to look at, okay, what are the local regulations there where you to actually make that happen? So I think a lot of those complications are not obvious up front, but definitely something that can hold back this model if not considered fully.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the pieces of advice I give brands who see a big opportunity on marketplaces is think about how you structure your business so that you can qualify to join these marketplaces.
Yeah.
Right. You use the UK as an example. I can tell you for most of these marketplaces in the UK, you got to meet 3 requirements. You have to have a UK company. You probably have to have UK VAT registration if you're going to sell a certain amount. And you've got to have a UBO or a significant decision maker in the company, right? Well, if you know that in advance, you can actually think about how to structure your business to meet some of these requirements for the markets that you expect to be in, right?
Yep.
Or as we've talked about before, you tap into this merchant of record capability in the places that you just don't want to do that, right? Yeah. So this is actually a really interesting profile for guys like you and I, because it's not necessarily solving a payments problem per se, but it very clearly fits squarely in the e-commerce channel of these businesses. And so they're very much thinking of it just like they think of their direct-to-consumer branded e-commerce business.
Absolutely.
All right. So prepare in advance is the advice, right? Make sure your business is ready to actually enter these fast-growing marketplaces. Okay, cool. A fun one here. The ambitious startup. I'll tell you what, I've been a part of a startup. It's hard to be a part of a startup. You got a lot of things to focus on, and you can't solve them all yourself. If you were talking to 3, 4, 5 person startup, Matt, what's the first piece of advice that you would give them on their payment strategy?
Something that's small but ambitious. It's just don't lose the ambition, but be practical. Be very considerate in some of the strategic choices that you make, especially in the markets. Depending on where you're coming from, I'm based here at our headquarters in the Netherlands, fairly small domestic market. If you're a small brand, you're starting to think internationally pretty early on. But there's still, even within that, you're not going to go from the Netherlands to the entirety of the European Union. You're going to, go to Belgium. You might go over to Germany, get one of the bigger markets, and think about things like that. So in terms of the markets and the cross-border piece, I think that's the way to go about things. But then also just know that as you pursue a strategy like that, you're almost always going to go with the low-hanging fruit first. So each incremental new country is probably going to be a little bit more complicated. Going from the Netherlands to Germany, probably not so bad. Then you go into, say, Spain or Poland, it's going to start to get a little bit more complicated. There might be things that are just not on your radar that make it harder to truly succeed there. So I think my personal view always just goes back to build that core, build that solid foundation, and that will empower you to start to make some of those bets.
And if you're building that core, I think this is something that's on a lot of startups' minds. How important or not important is it to get all of your technology choices right up front? By technology choices, I mean your payment provider, your tax solution, your fraud solution. Do you have to get it right on day one, first dollar of revenue? Or are you just trying to shoot for what's going to solve my needs for the next 1 to 2 years?
I don't think you have to. It's somewhere in the middle there, right? Like I wouldn't say that you have to get it 100% right, because the reality is very few people are going to get it 100% right out of the gate. But you still want to be able to do your research, do your homework, so that once you hit that true growth trajectory, especially thinking the hockey stick growth, that you're not running into a limitation where you have to go and rip and replace something very foundational. So again, I go back to kind of the core, like thinking of your very foundational technology. That's something I want to be thinking about. If it's truly ambitious and with growth plans, I want to be pretty confident that that's going to last a while. If I'm working with some partner to handle taxes in a new market, and 2 years down the road, it's a big mature market now, I can bring that in-house. Great. That's a good change to make. You take a little bit more control. That's all understandable.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is you don't necessarily have to get it all right up front, but you want to make sure there's no obvious identifiable blockers to your strategy in the choices that you're making.
Yeah. Do your homework, but also, you need to make some decisions, versus you don't want to do the analysis paralysis.
Yeah, especially as a startup, speed is everything in that world. Very good. All right. Okay, so we covered a lot of stuff there. I think we probably flooded people's minds with how scary this can be and what they need to be thinking about. So let's each maybe take a couple of minutes and just try and net it down. What's one thing a brand in one of these profiles can invest their time in next quarter, this quarter, next quarter, that really sets them up for, the next 4 quarters?
Yeah, I struggle to get past my. I start to sound like a broken record, but for the next quarter, we're really starting to think of talking about 2026 now. If depending on where I am in the life cycle, really focusing on the core market, but I do want to kind of carve out. Whether it's capacity, brain space, some type of like a layer available for innovation to say, I want to roll the dice on something. I'm not, it's maybe a 5 or 10% bandwidth, not necessarily, it's not going to be a risk to company effort, but let's try something new. That could be social. That could be being an early adopter and some of these agentic commerce protocols. That could be a complicated new market. I think some of those things, especially for companies that get kind of very comfortable, especially if you're in a large market like the US, you will eventually see that growth probably start to slow down, whether it's just the channels or the market writ large. So do that in a way that you can experiment proactively versus trying to be very reactive, where you're panicking and saying, okay, I really need to keep this going. And now, I need to make a decision really quickly. Haven't done any homework and prep time for it. So I think that's
sort of planting some seeds for the future.
Yes, exactly.
The sort of higher probability bets, if you will, that you would regret further down the road if you didn't invest a little bit of time on earlier. That's a good one. I like that. The advice I oftentimes give brands, regardless of which phase of their growth they're in, is probably going to feel a little overly practical, but I always feel like it's a good test of, is this a project that they should be spending their time on? The advice I give is take the next quarter and do a very thorough market analysis of 2 to 3 markets, the 2 to 3 that are on your mind the most, a very thorough analysis of these markets, and try to answer a couple of key questions. These are sometimes tough questions to ask yourself if you're a brand. One of the questions I think you should ask yourself is, why do I feel my products will be successful in these markets? Right? You're interested in them because you want to have a dialogue about this opportunity. You've got to be able to be very crisp about why you'll be successful there. The second question I always tell them to ask is, through what sales channels will you be successful? In other words, are you going down the right path right now with this sales channel, or is it another sales channel that actually gives you the highest odds of success? And then the last one is make sure you have a good foundational understanding of the requirements in each of those markets. And I don't mean surface level, like you want to have a really good, deep understanding of the requirements, because you're going to have to make some educated decisions about who you partner with, the technologies you use, things like that. And I always feel like the brands who have really done a thorough market research and understood the requirements that they're about to try and solve for are so much better positioned to make the right choices on the technology or the vendor that they end up moving forward with. And so it can feel a bit like maybe homework that you want to gloss over, right? Because you really just want to get to the strategy. But in my experience, if you go through that process, you just narrow in on the few countries that matter and really do a deep analysis, you're going to be thankful you did it later, because you're going to give yourself a higher odds of getting a return on that investment. Yeah. All right. So if you're a brand out there, you got some homework for the next 90 days.
Yeah,
right?
indeed.
And on Matthew's side, you can place some bets. I love that one. Yeah. Place a couple bets that'll pay off in the future. Good. All right. Well, I think we actually took pretty much all of our time here, Matt. I was hoping that we might have a couple of minutes at the end for some Q&A. What I would say to the audience is, if you have some questions or topics that maybe we didn't dive into today, feel free to hit myself on LinkedIn. Matt, I'm sure you'd probably feel the same way.
Yep.
We'd love to have a dialogue about how to help you think through a challenge, whether it's payments or something similar. And hopefully you all got some good content coming out of this discussion. So Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion. I know it was really valuable to the listeners, and you just got a ton of insights and a ton of experience in this space. So I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right.
Enjoyed it.
Cool. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Take care.
Bye now.